The morning Matilda Carver walked into the center of Dusthaven's main street with nothing but a folded land deed pressed against her heart. Every soul in that small Texas town stopped breathing at the same time. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was a place where the land itself seemed to hold opinions, strong ones, baked into the red clay and dried by a sun that showed no mercy to the weak. Dusthaven sat like a stubborn splinter in the heel of Randolph County, a town of 400 people who had scratched their existence out of nothing, who had planted root systems deep as mesquite trees, who had learned that survival was not a guarantee but a daily negotiation. The railroad had come to the neighboring county 2 years prior, and everyone knew what that meant. Land was not just land anymore. Land was money. Land was power. And power in the Texas Panhandle of 1878 wore a very specific face. That face belonged to Chester Holt, the cattle baron who had spent 15 years absorbing every parcel of ground between the Canadian River and the high plains like water soaking into dry earth. He was not a cruel man by the definitions of his own imagination, but he was an ambitious one, and in a time and place where ambition wore no leash, that distinction mattered very little to the people standing in its path. Chester Holt had 15 men riding for him. 15 men with iron on their hips and eyes that had learned the language of intimidation fluently. And on that clear October morning, 6 of those men sat on horseback in the center of Dusthaven's main street, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool air, their expressions wearing the lazy confidence of people who already know how the story ends. They were there for the Carver land. Matilda Carver was 28 years old, which in 1878 Texas meant she had already lived several lifetimes folded into one. She had buried her husband, Thomas Carver, 4 months prior, a fever that had taken him in 8 days, the kind of swift and senseless death the frontier handed out without apology. She had stood at his grave with her 7-year-old son Daniel beside her, and she had made herself a promise in the raw silence of that afternoon. She had promised Thomas, and she had promised herself, that she would not lose what they had built together. 320 acres of grassland, a solid farmhouse, a good well, and the deed to all of it signed by the Texas General Land Office in 1874 and recorded at the county courthouse. The land was hers. The law said so. And Matilda Carver had spent 28 years learning that the law and the truth were the only weapons a woman could carry openly in this world. What she had not expected, when Chester Holt's men arrived the previous evening with a notice claiming Thomas Carver had borrowed money against the land and defaulted on the debt, was the particular quality of silence that fell over Dusthaven like a heavy quilt. The kind of silence that meant people were watching but had decided, very carefully, not to be seen watching. She had gone to Sheriff Grady Potts, who was a decent enough man but also a man who had 3 children and a mortgage of his own, and who looked at Chester Holt's interests the way most men looked at bad weather, something to be endured rather than challenged. He had told her to consult a lawyer. The nearest lawyer was in Amarillo, 40 miles away, and Chester Holt's men would be waiting on her property at dawn. So Matilda Carver had made a different decision. She had dressed before the sun came up. She had put on the blue dress Thomas had always loved, the one with the white collar that made her dark eyes look even darker. She had pinned her brown hair up neat and tight, the way she did when she was preparing for something that required her to be larger than she felt. She had kissed Daniel's forehead while he slept, told him to stay with their neighbor Mrs. Oates until she came back, and then she had walked the 1.5 miles into Dusthaven Center in the early morning light, the land deed folded in 3 and held against her chest like a shield made of paper. Chester Holt's 6 men were already there when she arrived. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Cole Briggs who wore his hat low and his contempt openly, had barely glanced at her before speaking. "Mrs. Carver," he said from the height of his horse, making her name sound like something he was being asked to carry that he found inconveniently heavy. "Mr. Holt has been patient. He's given you notice. The property transfers today, and we're here to make sure that happens smooth." Matilda stopped walking. She was standing in the middle of the street, and the morning light was coming in long and golden from the east, and it caught her face in a way that made several people watching from doorways and windows later say they had never seen someone look so entirely composed and so entirely frightened at the same time, which was the truest description of courage they had ever accidentally witnessed. "I have the deed," she said, and her voice carried clean and clear in the still morning air. "The land was registered and recorded. My husband's signature is on it, and so is mine. There is no lien recorded at the county courthouse because I checked the records yesterday evening, and there is no record of any debt. If Mr. Holt has a claim, he can make it before a judge." Cole Briggs leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, Mrs. Carver, I am speaking," she said, and those 3 words hit the air with such precise, quiet authority that Briggs actually paused. "This deed is legal. This land is mine. And every person in this town is watching, which means every person in this town is a witness. If Mr. Holt's men ride onto my property today without a legal court order, they are trespassing on land belonging to a widow and her child, and that fact will be known in every county, in every courthouse, and in every newspaper I can reach." The street was absolutely, completely silent. Briggs looked at his men. His men looked at each other. The horses moved and breathed, and the leather of their saddles creaked, and somewhere in the silence a door opened very quietly. That was when Levi Keller stepped out of the Morning Star saloon, though calling it stepping out was perhaps too casual a word for what he did, which was more accurately described as appearing in the doorway with the particular deliberateness of a man who had been listening for some time and had finally reached a decision. Levi Keller was 32 years old, which made him 4 years older than Matilda, and he had come to Dusthaven 6 weeks prior with a horse, a bedroll, and a reputation that preceded him by about 3 counties. He was not a gunfighter, which was an important distinction. He had worked cattle for 15 years from the Kishom Trail to the Wyoming Territory, had driven 3 of the biggest herds anyone in the Panhandle had ever seen, and had the kind of quiet competence that comes from spending years solving problems in places where there are no easy solutions. He had a lean, weathered face, brown eyes that were good at reading distances and people, and hands that were capable and scarred in the way that working hands always are. He had been staying at the Morning Star for 6 weeks because he had been looking at land in Randolph County, thinking seriously about putting down roots, and because the owner of the Morning Star, old Pete Haverson, had a good kitchen and charged fair rates. He had heard about Matilda Carver's situation the previous evening. He had heard it the way news travels in small towns, in pieces, through walls, over supper. He had not said anything then, because it was not his business and he was new to this place, and he understood, in the way that experienced men do, that walking uninvited into someone else's trouble is a form of presumption. But he had thought about it through the long hours of the night, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath, and what he had found underneath was the simple, irreducible fact that what was happening to Matilda Carver was wrong. Not complicated wrong, not politically wrong, not maybe wrong depending on who you asked. Just plainly, clearly wrong, in the way that a man with a working conscience could not make himself comfortable with. So he stepped out into the morning. He walked to where Matilda was standing and stopped beside her, not in front of her, beside her, which was an important distinction that she noticed immediately, and that made something shift in her chest that she did not have a word for yet. He was not trying to take her problem away from her. He was trying to stand next to it with her. "Morning," he said to Cole Briggs, in the easy, unhurried way of a man who is not afraid of the conversation he is starting. Briggs looked at him with calculation. "Who are you?" "Levi Keller. I've been staying here in town." He pulled his hat down slightly against the morning light. "I happened to be listening just now. Mrs. Carver makes a reasonable point. If there's no recorded lien, then Chester Holt doesn't have a legal claim, and 6 armed men showing up to pressure a widow doesn't change that. I'd say anyone who wants to can observe that fact. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch his gun. He was wearing one, a worn Colt single-action army, but his hand stayed relaxed at his side. What he did do was look at Cole Briggs in a direct and steady way that suggested he had evaluated the situation and arrived at a position that he had no particular interest in abandoning. Briggs measured him. Men like Briggs were good at measuring men. It was a professional necessity, and what he measured in Levi Keller was something he did not enjoy finding, which was the particular quality of calm that genuine competence produces. Not bravado, not performance, just the steady, level-headed confidence of a man who has been in hard places and knows his own limits and knows when he is inside them. There were also, by this point, approximately 40 people watching from various positions along the main street of Dusthaven. The baker had come to his door. The Reverend was on the church steps. Mrs. Haverson from the dry goods store was standing on her porch with her hands folded. The schoolteacher, Mr. Ellis, had his window open. Sheriff Grady Potts had appeared at the edge of the street, looking uncomfortable in the way of a man who is trying to determine which direction history is moving, so he can be seen standing on the right side of it. Cole Briggs was no fool. He could count. And what he counted told him that this moment, right here, had shifted from a simple business matter into something that had witnesses and voices and edges, and that Chester Holt's instructions had been very clear about keeping things smooth. This was not smooth anymore. Mr. Holt will be speaking with his lawyer, Briggs said finally, his voice carrying the clipped dignity of a man accepting a tactical retreat. This matter isn't settled. Nobody said it was, Levi replied. Just said it isn't settled today. Briggs looked at Matilda one more time, with the particular look of a man who intends to return to an argument, and then he turned his horse, and his men turned with him, and they rode back down the main street and out of town in a slow, deliberate procession that tried very hard to look like it had been their own idea all along. The moment they were gone, the held breath of Dusthaven released itself all at once, and the sound of it was almost audible, a collective exhale that moved through the street like a small breeze. Matilda stood very still for a moment. Her hands, which had been pressed flat against the folded deed, were shaking slightly, and she pressed them harder to stop it, because she had promised herself she would not shake until she was somewhere private. She turned to look at the man standing beside her. He was looking at her in a way that was both careful and direct, the way a person looks when they are trying to see something clearly without imposing their own interpretation on it. His hat threw a shadow across his face but not his eyes. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very even, which cost her considerably. "You were doing fine," he said, and he meant it, which she could tell because there was nothing performative about it. "I just added a number to the room." She almost laughed. It surprised her, that almost laugh, the way it came up from somewhere she had not expected. "A number," she said. One more pair of eyes watching made it harder to pretend it was private business. She looked at him more carefully then. He was older than the cowboys she had grown up watching, or rather, not older in years, but more settled, the way certain kinds of wood are more settled than others, more dense and less likely to warp in bad weather. She noticed that he had not tried to take the deed from her, not even to look at it, which was interesting. Thomas would have taken the deed. Most men she knew would have taken the deed, examined it, pronounced their judgment on it, and handed it back with an explanation of what she ought to do next. This man had not even glanced at it. "I'm Matilda Carver," she said, though of course he already knew. "I know, I'm Levi Keller." He removed his hat briefly, the old formal gesture of introduction, and there was something in it that was sincere rather than performative. "I'm sorry about your husband." "Thank you," she said again, and this time it was quieter. The town was beginning to move around them, people coming out of their watching positions and drifting back toward their days, though with the particular energy of a community that has witnessed something and is now processing it loudly among themselves. Sheriff Potts was walking toward them with the expression of a man who has concluded that the situation resolving itself is the best outcome. Mrs. Carver, the sheriff said, stopping a few feet away and looking somewhere between apologetic and relieved. I hope you understand I was going to. You don't need to explain yourself to me, Sheriff Potts, Matilda said, and there was not cruelty in it, but there was clarity. But I would appreciate it if you could send a message to the county courthouse today confirming the status of my deed, in writing, so there's a record. Potts blinked. Then he nodded because there was really nothing else to do. Yes, ma'am, I'll do that today. Levi replaced his hat and was beginning to step back, the way of a man who has decided his presence has completed its purpose, when Matilda spoke again. Mr. Keller, he stopped. Are you busy this morning? He considered the question honestly. No particular plans. I'd like to go back to my property and check that everything is undisturbed. I would appreciate the company. She paused and something honest moved across her face. Not because I need protecting. I would just rather not be alone on the ride back. He understood the distinction. I'll get my horse, he said. The ride out to the Carver property took 35 minutes on horseback, following a dirt track that wound through stands of mesquite and dried grass the color of old gold. The morning had warmed slightly, and the sky above the Texas Panhandle was its characteristic enormous blue, the kind of sky that made everything feel simultaneously large and intimate, as though the landscape was conducting a private conversation with you at great volume. Matilda rode a solid bay mare named Lucy that Thomas had bought 4 years ago. Levi rode a dark gray gelding he called Smoke. They rode with a comfortable distance between them, not the awkward distance of strangers performing politeness, but the easy distance of two people who have already established, in the brief sharp crucible of the morning's events, that they are capable of being in each other's presence without complication. For a while they did not speak, and the silence was comfortable rather than strained, the kind that two people who are both used to open country tend to fall into naturally. How long have you been in Dusthaven? Matilda asked eventually. 6 weeks, came down from Dodge City, was considering land. Considering, she said, past tense. He glanced at her sideways. Reconsidering. After this morning. She looked straight ahead at the track. Chester Holt has been buying land in this county for years. Most people sold. Some didn't have a choice. My husband and I bought our parcel from the original homesteaders in 1874, registered it properly, never had any trouble until she stopped, rearranged something internal, and continued. Until Thomas died. It seems Mr. Holt concluded that a widow might be easier to pressure than a family. He was wrong, Levi said simply. She smiled, a small and private smile that she directed at the track ahead rather than at him. He was wrong, she agreed. The Carver property came into view around a bend in the track, a solid farmhouse built from limestone and cedar, a good well with a wooden frame, a barn that was slightly tilted but stoutly built, and the broad sweep of grassland beyond, the 320 acres that were exactly as Thomas had described them when they had first come to look, green in the wet months and gold in the dry months, and always, always enormous and full of sky. It was untouched. Holt's men had not come here. Either they had never intended to yet, or the morning's confrontation had delayed them. The horses and the few cattle she kept were undisturbed in the pasture. The house looked solid and undamaged. Matilda let out a breath that she had been holding since before she walked into town that morning. All right, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. All right. Levi stayed on his horse, giving her the moment without filling it. He was looking at the property with the practical eye of a man who has spent years assessing land and livestock, and what he saw was a well-chosen piece of ground that had been cared for, a farmhouse that was maintained with the attention of people who intended to stay, and grass that was good grass, the kind that held cattle well through all seasons. It's a good property, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She dismounted and tied Lucy to the fence post near the well, and after a moment he dismounted too and tied Smoke beside her. She went to check the house, and he walked the fence line on the near side, not because anyone had asked him to, but because it was the useful thing to do. And when she came back out onto the porch after a few minutes to say that everything inside was fine, he had completed a circuit of the near fence and found 2 posts that needed resetting. "The fence is mostly sound," he reported when she came down from the porch. "2 posts on the east side need to be driven deeper. I can see it from here." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that. I know." "Do you have a post driver?" She looked at him for another moment, something moving behind her eyes that was part evaluation, and part something she was not ready to name. "In the barn," she said. They worked the fence together that morning, which was an interesting thing to do with a person you had met 2 hours prior under extreme circumstances. But the work itself had a normalizing quality that neither of them spoke about because it did not need speaking about. Matilda knew how to work a fence post. Thomas had taught her, and she had taught herself the parts Thomas had not thought to cover. Levi worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular task approximately 400 times and found it neither exciting nor beneath him. When the posts were reset, Matilda heated water for coffee on the iron stove, and they sat at the kitchen table, a table Thomas had built from cedar, solid and square, and drank coffee from heavy tin cups while the morning climbed toward noon outside the window. "Can I ask you something?" Matilda said. "Yes." "Why did you come out this morning?" Into the street. She was watching him steadily. "You could have watched from the window." He turned his cup in his hands for a moment, and she noticed again that his hands were very capable looking, the hands of a person who has spent a lifetime solving physical problems. "I've ridden for a lot of outfits," he said, "seen a lot of territory. I've seen men use size and money to push people off their land before. It always looks the same." He paused. "It always looks wrong." "And that was enough." He met her eyes. "Wasn't it enough for you? You walked into that street alone." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her cup. "It was enough for me," she said quietly. "It was terrifying, but it was enough." "That's what I figured," he said. Watching from the window starts to feel like a decision after a while. She thought about that. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the mesquite at the edge of the yard, cycling through stolen songs with cheerful, unself-conscious confidence. Daniel would be home from Mrs. Oates after noon, she was thinking. She needed to explain to him what had happened in a way that was honest but not frightening. She needed to write a letter to the county courthouse. She needed to consider what Chester Holt's next move might be, and she needed to be 3 moves ahead of it. "I'm going to need to go to Amarillo," she said, "to speak to a lawyer. Get the deed situation fully documented and have someone review whether Holt can manufacture a legitimate legal claim." "That's smart," he said. "Do you know anyone in Amarillo?" "No, but I know who to ask." She paused. "Would you be willing to stay in Dusthaven a few more days, in case Holt's men come back before I can get to Amarillo and return?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mockingbird switched to a new song, something it had stolen from a bird that had probably never seen this part of Texas. "I was planning to stay anyway," he said. "I want to look at 2 more parcels before I decide." She nodded. "I'll pay you for your time. I don't have a great deal, but—" "No," he said, and it was not rude, but it was final. "I didn't come out this morning for payment." She looked at him across the table for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it was doing something interesting to the way the room looked, warm and ordinary and somehow, improbably, almost peaceful. "Then thank you," she said. "Again." He nodded, and he almost smiled, not quite, but almost, a small movement in the corner of his mouth that suggested the possibility of a smile. "You're welcome. Again." Daniel came home at noon, bursting through the door with the energy of a 7-year-old who had been constrained at Mrs. Oates' house all morning and was now released back into his own territory. He was a dark-eyed boy with his mother's coloring, and what Matilda privately believed was his father's fundamental stubbornness, manifested in the set of his small jaw and the way he approached problems. He stopped short in the kitchen doorway when he saw Levi Keller sitting at the table, and assessed him with the frank, uncomplicated scrutiny that children apply to adults before they learn to be polite about it. "Who are you?" Daniel asked. "Daniel," Matilda said. "It's all right," Levi said and looked at the boy directly, which was the right thing to do. "My name is Levi Keller. I've been staying in town. I helped your mother with something this morning." "What did you help with?" Daniel, Matilda began. "Some men came to cause trouble," Levi said, still directly to the boy, without condescension or softening, but also without frightening detail. "Your mother handled it. I just stood with her." Daniel considered this. "Were they the men that want our land?" "Yes." "Did they go away, for now?" Daniel looked at his mother. "Are they coming back?" Matilda crossed the room and put her hands on his shoulders, looking into his serious dark eyes. "Probably," she said honestly. "But we are going to make sure that when they do, the law is very clearly on our side so that there is nothing they can do." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "We're going to go to Amarillo in a few days and speak to a lawyer who will help us protect our land. Do you understand?" Daniel thought about it. Then he nodded, with the gravity of a small person accepting a large piece of information and deciding to trust the person delivering it. "Okay," he said. He looked at Levi again. "Do you know how to fix fences?" Levi's almost smile became slightly more actual. "I fixed 2 posts this morning." "Papa's fence has been needing work on the south side," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Oates' husband said he'd come look at it, but he never did." "Daniel," Matilda said, and the warning in it was gentle but present. "I can look at the south fence," Levi said to Daniel, and Matilda opened her mouth to object and then closed it again, because the simple practicality of it was hard to argue with, and because Daniel was already nodding with satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a small person who has identified a problem and located a solution in the same efficient transaction. Over the following days, a pattern established itself that none of them had planned, but all of them settled into with a naturalness that was its own kind of comment on how right it felt. Levi came out to the Carver property each morning and worked on whatever needed working on. There was always something, because running a property alone was the kind of task designed for 2 people, and Thomas had been gone 4 months. He worked on the south fence. He repaired a hinge on the barn door that had been leaning at a wrong angle. He helped Matilda move her small herd of 8 cattle to the better grazing ground on the north pasture. In the evenings before he rode back to town, Matilda cooked supper, and they ate together at the cedar table with Daniel between them. And Daniel, who was a child with a child's instincts, began talking to Levi with the easy familiarity that children reserve for people their instincts have approved of. Levi, for his part, was discovering things about Matilda Carver that surprised him, not because they contradicted his first impression of her, but because they added layers to it that he had not anticipated. She was deeply educated, which was unusual in 1878 Texas. She had grown up in Nashville, her father a schoolteacher, and she had read more widely than most men he had known. She had opinions about things that most women in her position were not supposed to have opinions about, and she expressed them without apology but also without aggression, in the simple, level-voiced way of someone who has been thinking carefully and is now sharing the results. She was funny, which surprised him most, because grief and humor are not incompatible, but they rarely coexist so gracefully. She had a dry, precise wit that emerged mostly in the evenings at the cedar table, directed usually at the general absurdity of the situations life tended to produce, and it made Levi laugh in the way he had not laughed in a long time, genuinely, from a real place. He noticed that she never talked about Thomas Carver the way some widows talk about their husbands. She did not make him into a saint or a story. When she spoke of him, which was sometimes, it was with the honest, particular affection of someone who had loved a specific real person and knew both the good and the complicated of that person. He respected that deeply, the way you respect any refusal to simplify something that was genuinely complex. He also noticed on the 3rd evening that she was watching him when she thought he was not watching her, and that the expression she wore in those moments was one he recognized the general shape of, because he was wearing the same expression when she was not looking at him. He was, he admitted to himself, riding back to town on the third evening under a sky full of early stars, in considerable trouble. Matilda Carver was in considerable trouble of her own. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. When you are a widow 4 months from the burial of your husband, in a house full of his presence and his absence simultaneously, love is not a thing you are looking for. She was looking for stability. She was looking for legal solutions to her land problem. She was looking for a way to make sure Daniel had breakfast every morning and would go to school in the fall and would grow up in the house his father had built. She was not looking at the weathered, capable face of Levi Keller across her cedar table and noticing the way he looked at her son, the way he talked to Daniel as though Daniel's thoughts were worth taking seriously, the way he had, on the second evening, patiently explained to a 7-year-old the mathematical principles behind the construction of a solid fence post, with a straightness and a genuine interest that had made Matilda put down her dishcloth and stand very still for a moment in the kitchen, doing something private that she would have called crying, except that it was too complicated for that simple word. She admitted to herself on the fourth morning, in considerable trouble. The trip to Amarillo was planned for the 5th day, which was a Monday. Levi had offered to ride with them, which Matilda had accepted after a conversation with herself that had concluded that accepting help was not weakness. It was mathematics. 2 adults and a child were safer on a 40-mile ride than 1 adult and a child. Matilda arranged for Mrs. Oates to look after the property and the cattle for 2 days. They left at dawn, Matilda and Daniel in the wagon and Levi riding alongside. The road to Amarillo was well traveled but not comfortable, following ridgelines and crossing dry creek beds, and moving through the enormous Panhandle landscape that seemed, in certain lights, to have no end in any direction. Daniel, who was 7 and had never been to Amarillo, was fascinated by everything he saw and asked questions continuously for the first 3 hours in the way that 7-year-olds do, without any apparent fatigue in the asking. Levi answered most of the questions. He explained the geology of the Caprock Escarpment when they crossed it. He identified the birds circling a thermal to the south as turkey vultures. He pointed out a herd of pronghorn moving fast across a far ridge, and told Daniel that pronghorn were the second fastest land animal on Earth, which produced from Daniel the immediate and fierce question of what the first was. And the subsequent 40 minutes were spent in a wide-ranging discussion of animal speed that Matilda listened to with her eyes on the road, and a warmth in her chest that she was tired of pretending was not there. They arrived in Amarillo in the early afternoon and found rooms at the Cattlemen's Hotel. Matilda engaged a lawyer the following morning, a man named Harold Fitch, who came recommended and who, upon examining her deed and her records and hearing the account of Chester Holt's claims, became very interested in a professional way that suggested he had been looking for a case of exactly this kind. "The deed is clean," Fitch told her, spreading the documents across his office desk. "This is properly registered. No lien was recorded in Randolph County. What I suspect Holt is attempting is a pressure campaign rather than a legitimate legal claim. He is hoping that, without your husband present, you won't know your rights well enough to contest it." He looked at her over his spectacles. "He misjudged you, Mrs. Carver." "He did," she said. "I will draft a formal letter on your behalf to the Randolph County Courthouse, confirming the title status and noting the aggressive actions of Holt's men. I will also send a copy to Holt's lawyer, making the position clear. If he attempts any further action, he'll be walking into a legal fight he cannot win on the merits." Fitch paused. "I should tell you that Chester Holt has influence in this region. A clean legal case doesn't always translate to a simple resolution." "I understand that," Matilda said, "but I'd rather fight it on ground that's true." Fitch smiled slowly. "So would I, Mrs. Carver, so would I." Levi had taken Daniel to see the railroad yards that afternoon while Matilda was in the lawyer's office, and when she found them afterward, she found Daniel standing on a fence post trying to see over the cattle pens into the switching yard beyond, with Levi's hand on the fence beside him in the easy, watchful readiness of someone making sure a small person does not fall. Daniel was talking about the locomotives with a passion that suggested he had already decided to build them someday, and Levi was listening with the interested expression of someone who is genuinely entertained rather than performing patience. Matilda stood at the edge of the scene for a moment before they saw her, and the warmth in her chest did something more specific that time, something that had a shape and a weight that she recognized finally for what it was. She walked forward and they both looked up, Daniel with excitement about locomotives and Levi with something quieter and more private. "How did it go?" Levi asked. "Very well," she said. "We have good footing now." She looked at him and the late afternoon light of Amarillo was between them, golden and direct. "Thank you for taking him. He has an interesting mind," Levi said, which was simply true and said without any obligation to be complimentary. Daniel jumped down from the fence post. "Mama, did you know that a locomotive can pull 150 cattle cars? I asked the man at the gate and he told me." "I did not know that," she said. "Levi says that's how they're going to move most of the cattle from the Panhandle in 10 years, on trains instead of drives." "Levi is probably right," she said and glanced at him, and he glanced at her. And for a moment there was something between them that was simply there, not negotiated or performed, just real and present in the Amarillo afternoon. They rode back to Dusthaven the following day, and the town felt different when they returned, or perhaps Matilda felt different about the town, as though the layer of anxiety that had been sitting over everything had thinned slightly. The legal situation was not resolved, but it was documented and defended and naming a problem is always the first step to controlling it. Chester Holt made his next move 10 days later, and it was not the move any of them had expected. He came himself. Chester Holt was 61 years old, a large man with a white mustache and the particular bearing of someone who has been important for so long that importance has simply become his resting state. The way a tree that has always grown in a certain direction simply grows that way. He arrived in Dusthaven in a coach, not on horseback, which was either because of his age or because of what it communicated about his sense of himself, and he came to the Morning Star saloon and asked to speak to Matilda Carver. The message was brought to Matilda at her property by a boy from town. Levi, who was there that morning working on the barn's tilted support beam, read her expression when she read the note. "What is it?" he asked. "Holt is in town. He wants to speak with me at the saloon." She folded the note. "He's coming himself. That means either he wants to negotiate or he wants to intimidate me more personally. Do you want to go?" She looked at the note again, then at the horizon, then at him. "Yes, because if he wants to negotiate, the only way to negotiate is to be there." She paused. "Will you come with me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. They rode into Dusthaven together and went to the Morning Star, where Chester Holt was sitting at a table in the back with 2 of his men standing at respectful distances and a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He stood when Matilda entered, which surprised her. It was a formal old-world gesture that she had not expected from a man who had sent armed riders to her property. "Mrs. Carver," he said, "thank you for coming." "Mr. Holt," she said, and sat down across from him without being invited to, which was its own small message. Levi took a position at the bar, in sight but not at the table, giving the meeting its appropriate shape. Chester Holt looked at her with the sharp, evaluating eyes of a man who has spent 60 years sizing up deals and people and stretches of ground. Then he looked at Levi, then back at Matilda. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "The approach my men took was not what I intended. I instructed Cole Briggs to make an offer. He took liberties with the interpretation of those instructions." Matilda listened to this without expression. "What kind of offer?" she said. "I want to buy your land, Mrs. Carver. $400 an acre. That is considerably above market, and you know it." She knew it. 320 acres at $400 an acre was $128,000, which was a sum so large she had to repeat it silently to herself to make sure she had the arithmetic right. It was more money than she could earn in 50 lifetimes at the usual rates of 1878 Texas. It was the kind of offer that was designed to make refusal feel not like a choice, but like an act of self-destruction. "Why?" she asked. "Because the railroad spur that is being planned will run through Randolph County in the next 3 years, and the water rights on your property are excellent. Your land is in a strategic position." He said this plainly, which she respected. He was not pretending this was charity. "Mr. Holt," she said, after a moment's silence that she let sit long enough to communicate that she was not impressed by large numbers in the way he was hoping. "I appreciate that you came yourself, and I appreciate the honest explanation. But that land is where my husband built our house. It is where my son has grown up. It is where I intend to remain." She met his eyes. "The answer is no." Chester Holt looked at her for a long moment. He was not, she thought, a stupid man. He was a man who was accustomed to having things a certain way, and had perhaps temporarily forgotten that this particular way was not the only way things could go. "If the railroad comes," he said, "the value of neighboring properties will benefit considerably. I'm offering you more than you would gain from that benefit." "Perhaps," she said, "but I will have my home and the benefit, and my son will still have his father's land. The answer remains no." Chester Holt set down his whiskey glass very carefully. He looked at Matilda with an expression that moved through several stages: frustration, recalculation, and then, unexpectedly, something that was close to respect. "You are a determined woman," he said. "I am a woman with a legal title and a good lawyer," she said, "which comes to the same thing." He almost smiled at that. "I believe my lawyer has received a letter from a Mr. Harold Fitch of Amarillo." "I believe that's correct." Holt sat back in his chair. "I won't pretend I won't look for other angles," he said, "but I will also tell Cole Briggs to stay off your property. You have my word on that for whatever it is worth to you." "I appreciate your word," she said carefully. "I will also appreciate it remaining true." They shook hands across the table, which was unusual for 1878, a woman extending her hand to a cattle baron, but Chester Holt shook it without comment. And when she stood to leave, he stood again, and there was in the gesture something that was not victory on either side but was at least a mutual recognition. Outside on the street in the October sunlight, Levi fell into step beside her, and they walked back to where the horses were tied. "Well," he said, "he's going to back off." For now, she untied Lucy's reins and ran her hand down the mare's neck. "He's not going to stop wanting the land, but he's going to try legitimate means, and legitimate means I can manage." Levi untied Smoke and stood for a moment looking at her with that direct, assessing look she had come to know. "You handled that well," he said. "I handled it honestly," she said, "which I think is the only way I know how to do things." "Same thing mostly," he said. They stood with their horses between them and the main street of Dusthaven carrying on around them, and the afternoon was doing something particular with the light that made everything look slightly more real than usual, the way certain afternoons do. "Levi," she said, and something in the way she said his name made him go still. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "Always," he said. "You came to Dusthaven looking for land. You said you were considering it. You've been here nearly 8 weeks now, spending time at my property and helping with my situation, and I find that I would like to know—" She stopped and restarted because she was a precise person and she wanted to say this precisely. "I would like to know what you intend. Not about the land, about this." She made a small, careful gesture that encompassed the space between them. He was quiet for a moment. A wagon went by on the street. The mockingbird that seemed to follow Matilda everywhere in her life was working somewhere in the cottonwood at the corner. "I came to Dusthaven looking for land," he said slowly, "and I found something I wasn't looking for." He looked at her steadily. "Which is the way the best things usually happen in my experience." He paused. "I find that I don't want to leave, and I find that the primary reason I don't want to leave has become very clear to me over the past few weeks." She held his gaze. "And what is the primary reason?" He took a slow breath. "You, Matilda." The way he said her name, not Mrs. Carver, not ma'am, just her name, simply and honestly, the way you say something true when you have stopped being careful about it, did something that she felt all the way through. "I am a widow," she said, which was not an objection but was a fact she needed to say out loud to have acknowledged. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm just telling you what's true for me." She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light moved. Lucy shifted her weight and blew softly. "Then I'll tell you what's true for me," she said. "I wasn't looking for this either. I wasn't looking for anything except a way to keep my home and raise my son." She paused, and something in her expression opened slightly, the way a window opens in a room that has been closed all winter. "But I think I've been finding something over these past weeks that I didn't expect, and I'm not ready to pretend I haven't." He looked at her for a long time with those brown eyes that were good at distances and people, and then he said, very quietly, "I'm glad." They stood there on the main street of Dusthaven, Texas, in October of 1878, with their horses and the afternoon light and the whole ordinary ongoing life of the town around them. And it was not a dramatic moment in any of the ways that dramatic moments are usually described. It was quiet and specific and very real. And perhaps that was exactly the right way for it to be. The weeks that followed were a kind of unfolding that neither of them rushed, because they were both the kind of people who understood that the things worth having are not improved by haste. Levi was still staying at the Morning Star, coming out to the property most mornings, riding back to town in the evenings, and in between there was the steady, comfortable rhythm of shared work and shared meals and conversation that grew longer and more layered each time, the way conversations do when two people are genuinely interested in the contents of each other's minds. They talked about everything. Matilda told him about Nashville and her childhood among books and chalk dust, and the particular loneliness of being a girl who liked ideas in a world that was not always sure what to do with girls who liked ideas. He told her about growing up in Missouri, one of 6 children in a family that had land but not enough of it, about leaving at 16 with a horse, and a determination that had carried him further than he had originally planned, about 15 years of cattle drives and wide-open country, and the particular education that comes from living outdoors in all weathers with only your own judgment to rely on. She told him about meeting Thomas Carver in Nashville at 20 years old and following him to Texas at 22, which had been the most terrifying and right decision of her life up to that point. "Were you happy?" Levi asked her once, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch after Daniel had gone to bed, the sky enormous and full of stars the way the Texas Panhandle sky always was on clear nights. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Thomas was a good man and a good husband, and I loved him. We built something good together." She looked at the stars for a moment. "I miss him. I will probably always miss him, but grief and happiness aren't opposites. They both fit in a person at the same time." "Yes," he said, and she thought he understood that from some experience she did not yet know, and she did not ask, but she noted it. He told her later on another evening about a woman he had been promised to in Wyoming 6 years ago, who had decided the life he led was not one she wanted to share, and who had been right to decide that, because he had not been ready to stop leading it. "I wasn't ready to put roots down," he said. "I didn't understand yet what I was looking for. And now," she said, he looked at her across the porch. "Now I know exactly what I'm looking for," he said, "which makes the looking considerably simpler." Daniel, with the instincts of a 7-year-old who has been motherless for half his life, in the sense of having only one parent to attend to the whole large business of childhood, had decided that Levi was the answer to a problem he had not known how to name. He did not say this in words because 7-year-olds generally do not operate in such explicit terms, but he demonstrated it in the way he placed himself in Levi's vicinity whenever possible, in the way he directed his most important questions to Levi specifically, in the way he had taken to calling him simply Levi, in the easy, claiming way that children use to indicate belonging. One Sunday in late October, Levi was teaching Daniel to throw a rope over the fence post in the yard, a skill of no immediate practical necessity, but of great aesthetic appeal to Daniel. And Matilda was watching from the kitchen window with her hands in flour and something happening in her chest that was so specific and so bright that it was almost painful. The way bright things are sometimes painful when you have been in dim light for a long time. She went to the doorway. "Levi," she said. He looked up from where he was kneeling beside Daniel, adjusting the boy's grip on the rope. "Stay for supper," she said, "and stay the evening. There's no reason to ride back to town tonight." It was simply said and simply meant, and he understood exactly what it was and what it was not, and he looked at her with those steady brown eyes for a moment. "All right," he said. He stayed for supper and he stayed for the evening, and they talked for a long time after Daniel was in bed, sitting at the cedar table with the lamp between them and the night around the house. And around 10 o'clock he looked at her across the table and said, "Matilda," in the way he had taken to saying her name, which was with a particular kind of attention, as though the word was worth saying carefully. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to court you, properly, if you'd allow it." She had been expecting this, and yet when he said it, she felt it precisely, in the specific place in the chest where true things land. "I would allow it," she said. "Very much." He reached across the cedar table and put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, the lamp throwing warm light between them, and it was one of those moments that you know while they are happening that you will carry for the rest of your life. November came in cold and bright, the kind of cold that the Texas Panhandle produces in November, which is clean and clear and moves fast across the open ground. Levi moved from the Morning Star to a room he rented from the Haverson family, which was respectable and also closer to the Carver property, which was convenient and also not coincidental. He came to the property every day now, and some days he came twice, once in the morning and once in the late afternoon, and Matilda's days had reorganized themselves around his presence in a way that felt so natural she sometimes forgot to notice it. They were careful, because this was 1878 and Dusthaven was a small town with opinions, and Matilda had no interest in providing those opinions with unnecessary fuel. But they were not invisible, and the town had by now concluded that something was happening between the widow Carver and the cowboy from Missouri, and the conclusion the town reached about this was largely, though not universally, positive. Mrs. Oates, who was Matilda's most reliable ally, declared that it was about time. The Reverend made a pointed comment about the redemptive qualities of new beginnings that Matilda chose to interpret charitably. Old Pete Haverson told Levi at breakfast one morning that Mrs. Carver was the finest woman in Randolph County, and that he had better treat her accordingly, which Levi received with perfect seriousness and the assurance that he intended nothing less. Sheriff Grady Potts, perhaps motivated by a combination of residual guilt and the genuine desire to be on the right side of things going forward, had indeed sent the formal confirmation letter to the county courthouse, and Harold Fitch's letter had produced the desired effect on Chester Holt's lawyer, who had written back with the deflating brevity of a man who has examined a legal problem and concluded it is not winnable. Chester Holt, to his credit, had kept his word. His men stayed off the Carver property, and the pressure campaign that had defined the first weeks of October had receded like floodwater, leaving the ground changed but navigable. The land, Matilda knew, was not a resolved issue in the long sense. Chester Holt was patient, and she had no illusions about that, but she had established, legally and publicly and personally, that she was not a target but a person with rights and the will and the ability to defend them, and that was a foundation she could stand on. She realized one afternoon in November while she was riding the fence line of the north pasture in the early winter light, genuinely happy. Not the borrowed happiness of surviving a crisis, not the relieved happiness of a danger past. Actual happiness, the kind with layers and substance, the kind that grows from something real, Her land was secure for the moment. Her son was well. And Levi Keller, who had walked out of a saloon doorway one October morning because he had been watching from a window and decided that watching was a choice, was coming to supper tonight. He had brought her a book from Amarillo, on his second trip to the city to look at supply costs for the small cattle operation he was beginning to plan. He had remembered that she had mentioned, weeks ago, a particular interest in natural science, and the book was a collection of essays on the geology of the American West, and the fact that he had remembered, and the fact that he had gone looking specifically told her more about him than anything else had. She had kissed him for the first time when she unwrapped the book, which she had not planned or decided in advance, but which had simply happened in the way that true things happen when you stop managing them. It was brief and quiet and very deliberate, and when she pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression of such unguarded happiness that she felt it warm her all the way through. "Thank you for the book," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "You're welcome," he said, and his was not quite steady either. The winter settled in earnest in December, and the Panhandle in December is a particular and demanding thing, with winds that come down from the northern plains with nothing to stop them and temperatures that can drop 20 degrees between noon and midnight. Matilda knew how to manage a property in winter. She and Thomas had learned it together over 4 years, but there was no denying that 2 sets of hands made it considerably more manageable, and Levi threw himself into the winter work with the same capable, undramatic competence he brought to everything. He moved, in the practical arithmetic of frontier winter, into the barn. Not the house. They were not married, and Dusthaven's opinions, while mostly favorable, had limits that both of them respected without needing to discuss. The barn was warm enough with the animals and the hay and the patched walls, and he set up a proper sleeping arrangement in the loft with a good blanket and a small iron stove that he mounted on a stone platform. And he was there, and the presence of him there made the winter feel less like a thing to be survived and more like a thing to be inhabited. They talked through the winter evenings about the future in the cautious, exploratory way that people talk about futures they are seriously considering, but have not yet fully committed to in words. Levi talked about his plan for the cattle operation, not a large operation like Holt's, nothing ambitious in that particular direction, but a solid working ranch of modest size, enough to be self-sustaining and grow slowly and be genuinely his. He talked about the land parcel he had looked at to the east of Matilda's property, 160 acres that the current owner was willing to sell at a fair price. Matilda listened and said, very carefully, one evening when they were sitting by the kitchen stove with the cold pressing against the windows, "The parcel you're looking at connects to my eastern fence line." He looked at her. "It does," he said. "Adjacent properties can be advantageous," she said, with the careful precision she used when she was being precise about something important. "They can," he said, in the same tone. They looked at each other across the kitchen stove and the lamplight and the winter night, and neither of them said anything more about it at that precise moment, because some conversations are better approached from multiple directions over time rather than completed in a single sitting. He asked her to marry him in January, on a Sunday, which was a day that felt right for important things. He did not do it dramatically, which would have been wrong for both of them. He did it at the kitchen table, with Daniel nearby reading the illustrated natural history book that Levi had also brought from Amarillo, because Daniel was a part of this and always had been, and any proposal that tried to happen around him rather than with him would have been dishonest. He said, "Matilda, I want to spend my life with you and Daniel. I want to build something here on this ground beside you, and I want it to be real and permanent. I'm asking you to marry me." She had known it was coming, in the way you know the sunrise is coming but the actual arrival of it still stops you. She looked at him for a long moment across the table. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." Daniel looked up from his book. He had the look of a person who has been listening carefully while pretending not to. "Are you getting married?" he asked. "Yes," Matilda said. Daniel considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old receiving significant information. Then he said, "Good," with a decisiveness that made them both laugh, and he went back to his book. They were married in Dusthaven's small church in February of 1879, on a day that was cold and clear, the sky blue as the dress Matilda wore, the same blue dress she had worn on the morning she had stood in the street with her land deed. It was, she thought, the right dress for both moments because they were connected by the same quality, the same willingness to stand on ground that was true and hold her position. The church was full. Dusthaven had concluded that this was a story worth celebrating, and the town showed up accordingly. Mrs. Oates in the front row with her good hat, Pete Haverson and his wife, the Reverend's hands shaking slightly with the emotion of officiating over something he was genuinely pleased by, and even, to Matilda's mild surprise, Sheriff Grady Potts in his best coat, looking at the proceedings with the expression of a man who has decided to be unambiguously on the right side of history going forward. Daniel stood beside Levi at the altar, because Matilda had asked if he could, and Levi had said he would not have it any other way. When the Reverend asked if there were any objections, Daniel had looked around the church with an alert and slightly dangerous expression, which caused a small ripple of laughter that the Reverend absorbed gracefully. Levi looked at Matilda when she reached the altar, and he looked at her the way he had looked at that first morning in the street and every morning since, with that direct and steady attention that she had come to understand was simply how he was. He was the kind of man who, when he chose to look at something, looked at it fully and without reservation. She looked back at him the same way. The vows they spoke were simple and old, the words that had been used for generations, but they meant them with the particular weight of people who had arrived at this moment through genuine difficulty and genuine choosing. And when the Reverend declared them married and Levi kissed her in the quiet, cold church in front of Dusthaven's entire population, there was a sound in the room that was partly applause and partly something more private that a room full of people make when they witness something real. The spring of 1879 was an extraordinary one in the Texas Panhandle, one of those springs that seem designed to demonstrate what the land is actually capable of when the weather cooperates, green across the grassland, in a way that made the whole territory look like something out of a painting. Levi bought the eastern parcel, the 160 acres, and it was registered and recorded properly, and he and Matilda combined the management of the two properties into a single operation that made sense as a whole in a way that neither had individually. He built out the cattle operation methodically, the way he did everything, without drama or excessive ambition, acquiring a good starting herd, and working the land with the patience of someone who understood that good ranches are built in years rather than seasons. Daniel, who was 8 by spring, and had the energy of a small person who has decided the outdoors is his primary domain, became Levi's shadow in all things ranch-related, and Levi taught him with the same seriousness and patience he brought to everything, which Daniel received with the fierce, concentrated attention of a child who understands he is being taught something that matters. Chester Holt made one more approach in March, this time by letter, offering an even larger sum for the combined Carver-Keller land. Matilda wrote back a polite and final refusal in her precise, level hand, and that was the end of it. Holt was 62 and no longer in the mood for fights he could not win on the merits, and he had enough land that adding this particular parcel had become a preference rather than a necessity. The letter he sent back was brief, and in its way respectful. Matilda filed it in the box of important documents alongside the land deed and the lawyer's letters, and closed the lid on that particular thread. She was at peace with the land. She was at peace with the town, and she was at peace in the deep and specific way that comes from choosing honestly with her life. In June, she told Levi that she was pregnant. He was in the barn when she told him, mending a broken leather strap with the focused attention he gave to all physical tasks. And when she said it, he went very still for a moment, the strap in his hands, and then he looked up at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, which was the complete and unguarded expression of a person receiving news they did not fully know how to hold. "Matilda," he said. "June, by my calculation," she said. "So the baby will come in late winter or early spring." He set down the strap and came to her, and put his hands on her face with a gentleness that was not delicate but was very specific, the careful contact of someone who is treating something as precious. And he said her name again, just her name, and she put her hands over his, and they stood there in the barn in the June morning, with the horses moving softly in their stalls and the light coming in through the gaps in the cedar boards. And it was one of those moments that is simply full, the way good moments are. Full all the way to the edges with something real. "I know this is different," she said, because it was important to say. "From Daniel, this is a different kind of beginning for you." "It is," he said. "It's the beginning of something I didn't know I was going to have." His thumbs moved gently against her cheeks. "I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for all of it." Daniel's reaction when they told him at supper that evening was characteristically direct and practical. He said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" And when Matilda said they did not know yet, he said, "I'd like a brother," and then added after a moment's reflection, "but a sister would be acceptable," which Levi received with the solemnity it deserved. The summer of 1879 was a working summer in every sense. The ranch demanded it, and Matilda, who was not the kind of person to be confined by her condition when she was healthy and capable, continued to manage the financial and legal aspects of the operation, while Levi, and with increasing usefulness, Daniel managed the physical work. She kept the books with the precision of her schoolteacher father's daughter. She negotiated with suppliers and buyers with the same level, unhurried directness she brought to everything. She wrote a long letter to Harold Fitch in Amarillo updating him on the legal situation, and he wrote back with satisfaction, and the news that Chester Holt had turned his attention westward, toward New Mexico territory. She thought about Thomas sometimes, in the summer, in the way that she always would. She thought about him honestly, without pretending that the thinking was painless, but also without pretending that happiness now was a betrayal of what had been real then. She had loved Thomas Carver, and she was grateful for the years they had had, and she would always carry him. She also loved Levi Keller, in the particular and growing way that you love someone who has chosen you and whom you have chosen, and the two loves existed in her at the same time without conflict, because the human heart is much larger on the inside than it appears from the outside. She stood at Thomas's grave on a September afternoon and talked to him for a little while, the way she sometimes did, and what she said was that Daniel was well and the land was safe, and that she had found something she had not gone looking for but was very glad to have found. She stood there in the September light with the mesquite sighing around the small plot and the Panhandle sky its enormous self above her, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. The baby came in March of 1880, on a night of late winter wind that moved around the corners of the house like it was looking for a way in and could not find one, because Levi had spent the winter months making sure every gap was patched and every hinge was solid and every wall was sound, because that was how he prepared for the things that mattered. The baby was a boy. Levi was outside the bedroom door for the entire labor, which lasted most of the night, sitting on the hard wooden chair in the hallway with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, doing the particular kind of waiting that is the hardest kind of waiting there is, the kind where there is absolutely nothing useful you can do, and all you can do is hold yourself together, while the most important things in the world happen behind a closed door. Mrs. Oates was with Matilda, and the doctor had come from Dusthaven, and Daniel had fallen asleep on the settee in the sitting room at about midnight and was now curled there with a blanket, his dark hair falling across his face. When the baby cried for the first time, the sound of it moved through Levi Keller like a physical thing, something that rearranged everything it passed through. He stood up from the chair. Mrs. Oates opened the bedroom door after a few minutes and told him he could come in. Matilda was propped against the pillows, tired in the specific and profound way of labor's aftermath, and she was holding a small, red-faced, furious person who was clearly not pleased with his recent change of circumstances. She looked up at Levi when he came in, and her face was everything exhausted and radiant and present in the way that only the most real moments produce. "He's healthy," she said. "He's perfect." Levi sat on the edge of the bed and she placed the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time in the March night while the wind moved around the house and the lamp threw warm light and Daniel slept in the next room. And the word that came to him was the same word Matilda had found, the same word that meant the opposite of lost: home. They named him James Thomas Keller, the Thomas for Thomas Carver, which Matilda had suggested and Levi had accepted without hesitation, because it was right. A name that carried something forward rather than burying it. James was, from the beginning, a loud and opinionated person with strong views about meals and sleep schedules and the quality of entertainment available to him. Daniel, who had asked for a brother and received one, was fascinated and slightly overwhelmed by the reality of an infant, which was considerably louder and more demanding than the theoretical brother he had requested. He adapted with the practical flexibility of a child who has already proven capable of adapting to large changes, and by the time James was 2 months old, Daniel had appointed himself his brother's primary guardian, a role he took seriously to the mild amusement and genuine gratitude of both his parents. The ranch grew through 1880 and into 1881, slow and steady, the way Levi had always planned it. A herd of 60 cattle became 80, became 100. The eastern pasture was brought fully into production. A second hand was hired in the spring of 1881, a young man named Pete Sorrell from Palo Duro Canyon, quiet and competent, who bunked in the barn and worked with the uncomplaining diligence of someone grateful to have solid work. Matilda managed the books and the correspondence and the legal dimensions of the operation with the precision that had kept them safe before, and continued to serve them now. The railroad spur came to Randolph County in 1882, as Chester Holt had predicted. It came 12 miles to the north of Dusthaven, which was close enough to be genuinely useful without being so close as to transform the town beyond recognition. Cattle could be moved to the spur and loaded there rather than driven all the way to Dodge City, which changed the economics of ranching in the county in ways that benefited every working outfit. The Keller Ranch benefited too, and the books looked better than they had, and Matilda allowed herself, reviewing the figures on a summer evening, a private moment of very deep satisfaction. Levi found her at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a small smile that she was directing at the numbers. "Good news in there?" he asked. "Very good news," she said. "This year's profit will allow us to sink the second well and still have a reserve." He sat down across from her at the cedar table, Thomas's table, which had become their table, which had heard so much of their life, and reached across and covered her hand with his, which was a gesture he had made 10,000 times by now, and which still meant exactly what it had the first time, in the lamplight of a winter evening when everything was still beginning. "We built something," he said. "We did," she said. And then, with the precision she always brought to important truths, "we built something worth building." He looked at her across the table with the same eyes that had stood beside her in the morning street of Dusthaven and decided, very quietly, to stop watching from windows. The same eyes that had learned her face over 4 years in every light and every season and still found it the most interesting thing in the view. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "Every morning when I wake up and I am on this land and in this house and you are here and the boys are here, Daniel yelling at the chickens and James trying to help with things he is too small to help with, I feel like a man who found exactly what he was looking for, even though he didn't know what he was looking for when he found it. He paused. "I just want to make sure you know that." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, the summer evening was long and golden, and the grassland was green the way it was in good rain years, and somewhere in the yard Daniel was demonstrating something to James, some piece of important information delivered in the serious older brother voice he used for such occasions. "I know it," she said, "and I want you to know the same." She turned her hand so it was holding his rather than being held by it. "I walked into that street alone because I had no other choice. And I thought the best outcome was keeping my land. I didn't know that the morning I spent terrified and determined in the middle of Dusthaven was the morning the rest of my life was going to begin." She looked at their joined hands. "You showed up. You didn't take over. You just stood beside me." "That's the only way it works," he said. "Yes," she said, "that is the only way it works." James made his presence felt at the kitchen doorway at this precise moment, appearing with an expression of urgent necessity and a chicken under his arm that had clearly not agreed to this situation. And the kitchen filled immediately with the noise and comedy of a toddler explaining the complicated circumstances that had led to this outcome. And Matilda and Levi both looked at their son and then at each other. And the laughter that came was the deep, easy, full kind. Dusthaven went on around them in the way that small Texas towns went on in the 1880s, with all the ordinary drama and ordinary beauty of lives being lived in a particular place at a particular time. The Morning Star Saloon changed hands when old Pete Haverson retired. The Reverend gave way to a younger man who was slightly more interested in the injustices of the period than his predecessor had been, which Matilda found encouraging. A schoolhouse was properly built in 1882, with the kind of real walls and real desks that made it a genuine institution rather than a borrowed space, and Daniel went there, and then Peter Sorrell's younger sister went there. And eventually the schoolhouse saw 2 generations of Dusthaven's children come through its doors. Daniel grew up with the serious, capable quality that had always been in him, sharpened by the combination of his mother's precise intelligence and the years of practical education that Levi had provided. By the time he was 16, he was running aspects of the ranch with genuine competence. By the time he was 18, he was talking about studying engineering in Dallas, which Matilda encouraged with the full force of her belief that children should become what they were actually suited to become. He went to Dallas in 1890, at 18, and wrote home every week, and came back for summers, and brought the energy of his growing understanding of the world back with him each time. James, 4 years younger and made of the combination of Matilda's determination and Levi's steadiness, grew up with an absolute and unshakable conviction that the Keller Ranch was the center of the universe, which manifested in a devotion to its operations that was both charming and useful. He was 12 when Daniel left for Dallas, and he simply expanded to fill the operational space Daniel had occupied, with the unconscious confidence of a child who has grown up certain of his place. A daughter came in 1884, which nobody had quite expected but everybody welcomed. Matilda was 34 by then and Levi was 38, and Clara Jane Keller arrived in April with the Panhandle spring, which seemed entirely appropriate, and she was from her first hours a person of such decided opinions and vivid personality that even the doctor who delivered her remarked that this was a child who knew what she wanted. Daniel, 14, and visiting his parents with the new grandeur of a young man who has begun to understand the world, held his sister for the first time with an expression of enormous and slightly terrified love. James, who was 4 and at the age when new babies are primarily understood as competition for resources, adapted more gradually but completely. Clara grew up in the house on the Carver-Keller land, the daughter of a woman who had stood alone in a street with a land deed in her voice, and she grew up knowing that story, because Matilda told it to all her children not as a heroic legend, but as a practical demonstration of the principle that what is right can be defended with truth and steadiness, that a clear legal basis and a level voice are tools of genuine power, and that the right people will stand beside you when you need them to. She also grew up knowing that the right person standing beside you is not the same thing as the right person standing in front of you. That was a distinction her mother considered worth passing on. By 1885, the Keller Ranch was 150 cattle strong and considered one of the reliably solid operations in Randolph County. Not the largest, not the most dramatic, but honest and consistent and built on ground that was genuinely theirs. Levi had put his name on land in Texas, had made his stake in the way that men of his generation and his type dreamed of when they were young men on the Kishom Trail in the early days, and the stake was real and permanent, and had the particular weight of something built rather than inherited. On an evening in the autumn of 1885, which was the 7th anniversary of the morning Matilda had walked into Dusthaven's Main Street with the land deed, Levi saddled 2 horses in the October evening, and they rode out onto the north pasture together, just the 2 of them, the way they had ridden together that first morning 7 years ago. The sky was doing its Panhandle thing, enormous and clear and full of early stars at the edges. They stopped on the crest of the low hill that gave the best view of the property, both parcels together, the original Carver homestead and the eastern parcel that had been Levi's first stake in this ground, all of it running together in the dying light, the farmhouse and the barn and the new storage building and the 2 wells, the cattle moving slowly in the north pasture, the fence lines that Levi had maintained and extended and repaired over 7 years of seasons. "Do you remember what you were thinking," Levi said, "when you walked into that street?" She thought about it the way you think about something you know well from the inside but rarely examine from the outside. "I was thinking about the deed," she said, "about making sure I held it exactly right where people could see it, and I was thinking about Daniel. I was thinking that if I failed, what that would mean for him." She paused. "And I was thinking that I was very frightened, but that being frightened was not a reason to stop." "That's what I saw," he said, "from the window. A woman who was frightened and standing anyway. She looked at him across the horses and the hill and the October light. And that's why you came out." "That's why I came out," he said. "I couldn't make myself stay at the window." She smiled at him, the smile that was not the careful, private one from the early months, but the full, uncomplicated one that she had learned to wear in his presence, the one that was simply happy without reservation. "I'm glad you couldn't," she said. "So am I," he said, "every morning." He reached across and she took his hand, and they sat on horseback on the hill above their land, while the stars came out one by one in the October Panhandle sky, and the cattle moved below them in the settling dark. And from the direction of the house came the distant sound of Clara talking to James about something important, and the ordinary, irreplaceable music of a life that was genuinely good. The whole of it, the land, the children, the cedar table, the morning street, the first reached across hand in the lamplight, the wedding in the cold February church, the baby in the March wind, the years of seasons and work and laughter, and the kind of love that grows larger the more you give it. The whole of it was theirs, built from truth and steadiness, and the particular courage of 2 people who had both, in their different ways, learned that the things worth having are worth standing in the middle of the street for. Matilda Carver had walked into that street alone. She had stood with nothing but a land deed in her voice, and the whole town had held its breath. And then Levi Keller had walked out of a doorway and stood beside her, not in front of her, and the rest of their life had begun. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.